So I'm really tired and I meant to do this video much earlier. Um, I mainly just wanted to talk about the idea of being happy and how that's a overrated concept. A lot of times people will be competitive in our society about who's happier. Who is the happier person, and what makes them happy and why are they happy, and like lots of comparisons, like I want to be as happy as that person, or that person will see my unhappiness, or the world will see my unhappiness, and that's a scary thing. I need to always pretend to be happy. But I think it's a normal reaction in the world that we live in today to be unhappy. I actually think, like in another video, I talked about the leaves of the tree and how if we are the plant, if human civilization is a plant, then the leaves turning brown are like the depressed women of this great big bush or something. And if the women are depressed and sad, then that really says something about the community. It says something about the civilization, that the women are depressed and they're the barometers, they're the caretakers of the children of the earth and so forth. And if they're getting sick, the answer isn't medication. The answer isn't all these medications that are out there. The answer is heal the earth. The answer is heal the children. The answer is make it a happy world, make it a happy society. There are energies afoot potentially that benefit from war, that benefit from people fighting. And it's so important to look deeply at that, because if the world is sick, if the world is unwell, then to make it well, we have to address what makes it sick. And what makes it sick is wars and lies and deceit and fictitious governments and fake people and, just evil. These are all the things that make it a harsh world, but they haven't always existed to the degree that they exist today. So we're living in this very challenging time, I believe, and then on top of that, you have people that basically are the barometers of civilization, and if they're getting sick, like the answer again is not the medication. Like, don't medicate these people. If they're the barometers to tell us that, like, if they're the most sensitive and they're sensing that the world is fucked up, like, then let's honor that. Let's recognize that that's real and that's true and that's a concern for all of us. And we should be concerned as a joint world. We should be concerned about how do we make the world a better place, and how do we survive and thrive and be kind to each other and have goodness spread and not be hung up on religion and not be hung up on divisiveness and separation. So what's unfortunate is there's a lot of like happiness shaming, I almost want to call it, that I see in society today, where especially in Western culture, it's very much like who's happier and who's not happy, and like let's compare that and let's battle it out with like who's a happier person. And it's just really heartbreaking, because it isn't necessarily the correct conditions for being blissfully happy. Like if you're blissfully happy, like great, but I don't know if how connected you are with like how challenging the world is today. And it's important to be awake, and it's important to be present for the existence that you are around and surrounded by. Like this could be an alternative reality that like none of us really recognize like exists. Like this could totally be a parallel universe that none of us recognizes as being real or what have you. But the point is that this is the current reality, and things aren't good in so many respects. Like there are so many concerns in the world that are truly of concern, and that are challenging, and that I think anyone who has any kind of sensitivity to would really feel quite acutely and really be quite affected by. So when you see all this pain and suffering in the world, and you think about the millions of souls just lost due to whatever, you realize we're in this time, of great intensity or great whatever, but that we could be in a time where things could shift and we could, change things. But part of what helps us to change things is when we get like angry or contemplative or disturbed or, you know, really evaluating things. Those kinds of moods are not like this blissful, happy sticker, that let's say humanity is at a place right now where it's like this roadkill in the middle of the road, and it's kind of tragic and everything, but it's like, that's life, right? Like life's just that tough. Like you just get hit by a truck and it's over, right? It's almost like in a moment like that where some poor fool runs into, a moose, and the moose is laying in the middle of the road dead, and or just, a smaller animal. And someone comes along and is like, well, where's your smile? Like, stick a smile on that, buddy. And like slaps a big happy smiley face sticker on the dead carcass laying in the middle of the road. Like some moments in human history, like when you think about the tragedies that exist today, and I think so many of us are truly in touch with other people and other animals and other communities and other rivers and other forests that are crying out, that are literally like crying. They're like, help, we need help. Like indigenous peoples that are having oil companies like just rip up their homes and so forth. Like all these animals that they're losing their homes due to human development. And it's just so important when you think about all the wars and all the suffering and all the corruption, like that. How do you affect change is you feel contemplative, right? So contemplative is not a big fat happy sticker stuck on some big moose carcass in the middle of the road. Like that's not really like thinking about what does this mean, and what does the bigger picture mean, and so forth. And that's how we affect change, as we start to become contemplative. So sometimes people are competitive about this happiness factor. Like, I'm really happy. Like, how happy are you? I'm really happy. Oh, you seem very happy. And like, comparing like who seems happier, like who is genuinely more happy in their lives. And like, for one, where did we get this belief that there's only a finite amount of happiness, that there's only a certain amount allotted? So like, what if there's enough happiness for everybody and everyone gets to be blissfully happy, and it's never a sense of who has more whatever? That there's enough happiness for everybody. We don't have to be competitive about it. And then the other part of that is why are we being competitive about happiness when happiness isn't even really an appropriate emotion, I would say, to be having right now? I would say that in this time and space in human history, that so much is happening, and there's so much intense energy afoot, and so many dramatic changes that are occurring, and so much environmental devastation, and just political turmoil and things like this. It's not really a time for blissful happiness like that big happy sticker, right, stuck on that carcass in the middle of the road. Like, we kind of are, in a sense, that carcass in the middle of the road, or maybe we're the driver who hit the carcass or hit the moose, or maybe we're both, or it's just kind of a stressful moment, in terms of what's happening in the world today. And so maybe the blissful happiness isn't really where it's at, isn't really where people should be, and really it's not appropriate. So it's almost like in a rape scene, or a rape crime being investigated. Like, what if the investigator on the crime scene was like, I don't know, doing belly jokes or something while some woman was pulling herself together, right? It's just really important to think about the appropriateness of what environment you're in. And literally, if you are thinking about where we're at in terms of human civilization, and in terms of where we are at this moment in time, it's just important to recognize that we're in such a time period that maybe having this concept that we should be blissfully happy is like wildly inappropriate. Because a lot of times, like, you'll see criticism for like super famous people having really nice clothing or really nice this, and people will say like, oh, and that could have fed like a small village in Africa. And I think to some degree there is some of that, which is just like, at this time, in order to affect change, let's say you decide to use your money to affect change. If we decide to affect change, we have to be contemplative in order to affect change. We have to be contemplative before we get angry, or before we get motivated, or before we get impassioned about something, or furious, or, angry. And did I mention angry? So you need to be contemplative first. So if we're in this like game where we're caught up in happiness, and we're like, how happy are you, and how happy are you? Like, you're never allowed to have these other emotions that are so important to life, right? Which are like sadness, and sadness can teach us lots of things. I think sadness can be very helpful at times in our life to really do deep grieving and be really sad and be present in that sadness. Sometimes we lose people, we lose moments of our life, and just really important to be present to that. So sadness, it's important to feel sadness and anger and upset and furious and righteous indignation, and feel down in the dumps and feel moody. And it's important to just be alive and have a whole host of emotions. So the whole idea that we just become this homogenous happy all the time, like we never have problems, like I'm just so happy all the time. It's really not helpful to each other. It's almost very unhealthy. We should be modeling how to be more healthy, which means having emotions of all kinds. That means you can express fear, and you can say, I feel insecure, or I feel scared, I feel betrayed, or I feel hopeless, or that these are real emotions that humans experience. So it's a very plastic obsession to expect that people only will express this happiness, or that that's all of our goals. Like, that somehow we bought like this concept, we've just bought it, that we really just need to always be happy, and then if we're not happy, something's wrong with us. When that's not true, because sometimes we're not going to be happy, and that's okay. We don't have to always be happy. And I think that's another thing we've been taught, is that, especially for women, if they're those barometers of the civilization, I think it can be like upsetting to, I think, the rest of civilization, to have these women get angry and get upset and so forth, and that usually affects change maybe in the civilization. And so it's just important to recognize that I think sometimes people give that message to women, which is, I can't deal with your anger, and I can't deal with your sadness, but I can deal with your joy, and I can deal with your happiness. So because I'm only comfortable dealing with you in that aspect, because perhaps men or the rest of civilization notices that when women get sick or women get unhappy, that it means the civilization is failing. So they kind of want to prop up the civilization. So maybe they aren't comfortable with having people, especially women, show depression or show sadness or show sickness. It's interesting how much medication is offered to women in terms of depression. I think as a society, we're very uncomfortable with that depressive aspect of women, and the whole concept of women in madness. I think sometimes mental illness is used as a way to make women behave, and it's kind of a controlling thing with women, that you can basically call a woman mentally ill, and that will make her feel like there's something wrong with her. But it plays into a lot of those ideas around women and madness that Simone de Beauvoir talked about as well in her book. But there's just a lot of concepts around these chains that almost exist to entrap women into behaving, or into towing the party line, or what have you, which is to imply that they might be hysterical. There's just a long history of this, and it's bizarre and freaky and misogynistic, but it's very pervasive. And so I think even today women deal with that secret thought, which is, well, then they could call me crazy, right? Then they could call me crazy, and if they call me crazy, that takes away my power, and it dismisses my voice. Like, once you call someone crazy, there's just like these words that are like very coded, that just have a hypnotic effect on our society. So when you hear them, you just automatically dismiss the person who's saying those words or saying those ideas. It's very interesting to notice. But I think crazy is one of those words, and I think for women, they've just had that word thrown at them throughout history, and hysteria and just different things that have been used to dismiss women's voice. And so I think women kind of carry that historical trauma of just feeling like, oh, well, part of voicing my voice is taking into consideration that my voice won't be heard if it's too alternative or it's too aggressive or something like this. And so I think part of why we medicate women's depression and so forth is that we're trying to make that voice not as loud in that way from that place. So when someone comes at you with the happiness weapon, I like to call it the happiness weapon, because there's like the crazy weapon with women, and then there's the happiness weapon. These are like my two big weapons with women. The happiness weapon says, hey, I think that you could be happier, and I think that you're miserable all the time. Now, in my case, I'm someone that likes to complain all the time. It's like my little special music. Like, I'm a bird that complains. So, like, anyone that knows me knows I complain incessantly. So that's not really, I'm not a good example of this, but basically, the happiness weapon is when people come at you and they're like, you don't seem very happy, right? And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, and you have to like, before you realize you've been brainwashed about happiness, you're like, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. I should be happy. Like, why aren't I more happy? Or what's wrong with me? And there's like instant shame you feel like, oh, I'm a bad person and I'm not happy and there's something wrong with me and I should be taking a pill, right? So you feel like, and then you have to kind of check in with yourself and like your other self for a second, kind of have a little powwow and just be like, happy, happy, happy. Wait a second. We decided that happy, if you remember, happy we decided was an overused like plastic concept where people never had any other emotion and they act like really stupid and fake, or it's not always accomplished. You can't accomplish that all the time. It's just something you feel occasionally, but it's not like an all the time feeling. We already kind of had this discussion, don't you remember? And then I have to be like, oh, right, we had a discussion. So we don't care about happy. And like the other part of me is like, no, we never cared about happy. Oh, okay. So what do I do when they say, you don't seem happy? Well, just tell them that that's okay. You don't need to be happy. Okay. So then you go back to whomever and you say, I'm happy, or or I'm, I don't need to be happy all the time or whatever. But you take a blow, right? And that's what I really wanted to talk about, was like how much it hurts. You feel so low, right? Because someone is saying you're not successful, because that's what happy is, right? That's what happiness is in our society. Like, you're not successful, or you're not accomplished, or you're not well received, or you're not just something. You're not something. And you feel less than. You feel like you're inadequate, like you failed at life, right? Like there was a test on life and you got like a C minus, you're just feeling pretty shitty about the grade you just got. And you really have to do some self-reflection to be like, I don't even give a shit about being a plastic fake happy person. And I think I am relatively happy. Like, I think I'm more of like a real happy instead of like a fake happy. But like, I like having different emotions and I like having different feelings. And I like having days where I'm frustrated or in a bad mood, because that's just like the natural evolution of life. And I also look around me and I see how much tragedy and sadness and trouble there is in the world, and so much that's of concern. And so I think I have some righteous anger. And then I get kind of defensive because I feel like my righteous anger is not unhappiness. It's anger at the system. It's anger at humanity. It's anger at people in power who misuse their power and don't make appropriate decisions and don't really evaluate power properly, and fighting for the underdog. So these are things that I have righteous indignation about, but that's not unhappiness. I don't think righteous indignation is unhappiness. And it really troubles me as a female to really experience that sense of like, I wonder if a man would be called unhappy or challenged about his happiness. I wonder if someone would walk up to a man and say, I need to stick a sticker on you that says you're happy, even if humanity is that, moose, that dead moose in the road, and the moment doesn't deserve, a happiness sticker. I wonder if a man would have that pressure put on him in the same circumstance, if he was expressing righteous indignation, because maybe it's not a time for any of that. Maybe it's a time for righteous indignation, and righteous indignation might look like angry women, and if they're the barometers of civilization, maybe it'll look like depressed women, and that's okay. um so the other weapon, I said there was the angry weapon. I'm forgetting the second weapon. It'll come back to me. So women are expected to be happy, right? I think society has that expectation. And so when women aren't unhappy, I think it can make people nervous. And so I think that there's sometimes a seeking to medicate that in some way, like, what can we do to take away that? Because it makes us nervous as a society. We sense that that means like trouble for the civilization. We just kind of want to mute that little annoying voice, because it just kind of reminds us of something, I think probably in our bones and our microbial DNA, that we're just like, oh, that's bad news for society. I don't think I really want to see this many depressed women, or this many women that are at their wits' end, or what have you. And so I think society gets very concerned about, anger with women and depression with women. So sadness and anger, those are like the two things that women aren't really allowed to express or show. And so I think there's a lot of times a desire to mute that, as a society, those leaves on the periphery of civilization, if women are those leaves. So the idea of weapons coming at us from others, I think sometimes can be steeped in sexism. So if someone says, I think you should be happier, that is a judgment on that your perceived that your righteousness is perceived as anger issues. And society isn't really willing to deal with angry women. There's only certain roles that are allowed in society for women, and angry women really isn't a role that's allowed for women. So it's interesting to note that there's kind of these limited roles for women. And I think there's some natural mood changes with women that don't necessarily occur with men in the same way. So a lot of times when we talk about moon cycles and things like this, I think that women sometimes are on a different cycle, and we don't really take that into consideration. Like, we don't treat women differently in terms of respecting that and working with that. I think we're a very male-dominated society in terms of, like, women are told, consciously or unconsciously, they're told, like, you need to adapt to, like, the ways of the man and men's schedules and so forth. So there's a lot, I think, that women go through that isn't really discussed in society, and that society doesn't really want to hear. Like, when women receive sexual abuse and sexual molestation by virtue of, like, just walking down the street and things like that, I think a lot of times these women have these emotions and feelings of being victimized, so they carry that into their experiences with men. It's like they've been preyed upon their whole life by the male sex, and so I think sometimes by the time women get into adulthood, they're pretty well trained just by society's standards of how women are treated, that men start to treat women a certain way at a certain age, and I think it indoctrinates women into a sense of not always subservience, but definitely like taking their cues from men. So if the men in power are rejecting you, I think even if it's friends, if they're saying like you don't seem happy or what have you, that really can set you back. So I think the other one that I'd mentioned was the crazy weapon, which is telling women that you're crazy I forget if that was the correct one, but that one seems relevant as well. So basically, with women in madness and women in the history of being considered witches and just anything having to do with mental health, that there's like been this long association. Freud, of course, contributed to it as well, but of making women these mentally ill kind of subjects, these patients, these ongoing patients, the rest of their lives. And really, it's just like more sexual victimization. Like, instead of understanding the female psyche and really worshiping or respecting the female psyche, which can be different from men's, there's just this real pathologizing of the female psyche, which is different than men's, I would say. And it's just heartbreaking in a lot of respects, because I think as a society we lose a lot of female intuition, we lose a lot of female awareness and spirituality and insight that women bring to the equation, because for one, the women that are allowed to rise in power, sometimes they have really had to become, they have embodied the spirit of masculinity and kind of driving feelings deep and being very homogenous and not really being like very vocal, angry women and what have you. But to be an angry woman in terms of being like a righteous woman, like righteously indignant, I think it takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of chutzpah in this life to do that work, because you're constantly meeting with even subtle sexisms, like having a friend say you don't seem happy, or you don't, or you're crazy about this or something. Just the verbiage that can be dropped about little things, that these little you know trigger words that can really like just kind of stir a woman up. And it's discrimination. It's like, one of those prejudices where you get hit with a stereotype. Like, any group can get hit with a stereotype. You get hit with it, and like, it shouldn't trip you up, but